Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung-helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
All right, recording in progress. Perfect. And we begin. We begin with this very special topic, which is resurrection and rebirth. And it is the second part to an event that I had before, which was on suffering and sacrifice, and which I basically ended in the dark night of the soul, where everything seems lost, everything seems hopeless. And this is the lowest point where characters in movies or stories find themselves in, but also where we find ourselves in struggling situations. So this was in the past. This is available as a podcast recording. And I want to make something clear from the beginning. Resurrection and rebirth, we're concerning ourselves with a symbolic understanding, a psychological understanding. We will not necessarily talk about whether physical resurrection as such is possible or not. This is metaphysics. We will talk about it, how Jung understood it, and why he investigated so much into this topic. And he even jokingly said, it's quite the coincidence that Freud is so involved with sexuality and with sex and pleasure, and his name in German being something like joy. And his name, Jung, meaning young in German, and he being so concerned with transformation, with basically resurrection, rebirth, with how people can change from one thing into another. So he calls that pretty ironic. And to help with this topic, I will talk just quickly about the last event with suffering and sacrifice, what it was about, and like the key point there, because this event will build on this. So the main concept in Jungian psychology is that we start out from a place as human beings, and we're pretty limited in what we can do. Like a small baby human being is pretty limited in its way, how to interact with the world, how to adapt to the world. And so we start out as limited beings in an unlimited universe. And this process of changing and adaptation is very much associated with suffering and a felt sense of suffering, because we hit our head constantly on our own limitations and on the world, and we need to change and adapt. And this normally is pretty, painful. What Jung dealt with in his practice with his patients was a kind of suffering that seems unnecessary, in the sense of he had patients who suffered in the wrong place in their lives. So they were more concerned about the symptoms of their problems than the problems themselves. And symptoms can create really a lot of problems. But if you don't deal with the root causes, there will be always symptoms. There will be always suffering from that. So he noticed that it is something pretty rare that somebody head first confronts their problems and their shortcomings and tries to solve that. But instead, they kind of shirk away, they hide away and suffer in that unnecessarily, as you would call it. And what distinguishes like this unnecessary suffering from the real suffering? The real suffering gets alleviated, but also the unnecessary suffering, when you do a purposeful sacrifice. When you sacrifice something about yourself, we're speaking here psychologically still, that opens you up for the possibility to do more and also to discard the things in you which are not helpful, that you're blocked, that you have certain ideas, certain emotions, certain intuitions that hinder you in your normal life. And this is the way to the dark valley. Jung asked this very basic question: if enlightenment, like higher consciousness and all these different things, is so important and so necessary and such a good place to be, then why are not more people enlightened and on a higher consciousness? And he says, because you have to go to this very dark valley, you have to go there and you have to sacrifice, you need to change, you need to adapt, and this is painful. And this is why not so many people do it, at least not willfully. And this is also codified in our culture, in our stories, in the myths that we tell us. And for that, we have the hero who does great tasks and things and redeems himself and the world through his actions. And one of the most archetypal stories we have for that in the West, the story of Jesus Christ. So when we talk about suffering and sacrifice, this is a very archetypal story for that. So this was a short summary of what we talked about last time. And now we continue, and we continue from the lowest point, which is death. And what I want to help you understand at this point is that the resurrection and rebirth part is a little bit harder to understand intellectually. Let's say suffering and sacrifice, this is something that people experience on a day-to-day basis in their daily lives. So there's a pretty easy way to talk about it. Resurrection and rebirth is a little bit more abstract. You kind of have to have the experience to kind of get it, let's say. So this language of resurrection and rebirth becomes more symbolic. It becomes a little bit more mysterious. So also the way how Jung talks about it is how cultures before also talked about it, which seems a kind of mystical way. So what I want to make clear at this point, we're moving now in a symbolic territory, and we should not take stuff too literally that's being talked about, but rather than take apart what is meant by that. So, and this is what this quote is about. A corpse is buried with the idea of resurrection. That is, of course, primitive mentality. One fertilizes the mother by putting a corpse into her, and she will transform it and give it rebirth in time. It is as if one put a seed into the ground, like the age-old symbolism in the church hymns. It vanishes into the ground and rises new as a plant. Green wheat will appear instead of the buried grain. So the burial is at the same time a preparatory sacrificial rite, which induces the mother or the unconscious to give birth. It is as if one fed the cavernous Mother Earth with human flesh so that she may give body to the suspended potentiality of the unconscious contents. All right. This is why I give a little bit of introduction, saying we have to look at this symbolically. The idea is here that when we want new things, that several things have to take place for that. We have like the spiritual abstract idea, like a seed, and then the manifestation that needs to come out of that. And in symbolic terms, this is very much associated with the masculine and the feminine. So the feminine is a thing that gives form, that gives body, that creates. And the masculine is basically the potentiality, which needs a body. So both things need to be in place to create something. So what happens when something dies and loses its vitality, that it needs to kind of turn inward to be reborn again. Jung, for example, noticed that in a lot of his patients, that when they would have a neurosis, and so we would today call it depression, that their energy, their liveliness, their outward action, their willpower would be very much reduced. It would kind of sink into the unconscious, into the psyche. And there something new would be assembled, would gather strength there. So the energy is not gone, but it's in a different place. So this is what's basically described here, that what has died and lost its vitality needs to go into the unconscious, into the dark place to be reborn again. And we have this and see this in our daily lives when the sun rises and it disappears in the evening again to come out with full strength in the beginning of the morning. This is a complete cycle that has been mythologized over the ages and through different cultures. So there's this image of things shining bright, being alive, but then needing to go for resurrection, for rebirth, for revitalization into the dark place to come out. So it's a very much circle that repeats itself. So this is why, in this case, it's called the Mother Earth, because everything starts with the mother, it ends there, but also it begins from there anew again. So this is, of course, not what's necessarily happening literally, but how Jung sees human beings act and communicate in a large degree is in a symbolic manner. So when we do something, we do it very much in the accordance to our psyche. That means this acting out of the burial and the rebirth, for example, with like Jesus, put him in a cave, 3 days later he comes back. This renewal is codified in the symbolic language, in the culture, because our psyche very much works in the same way. And this is, at least from a Jungian standpoint, the way how to approach the psyche, by seeing how human beings communicate and how they act. So Jung sees there in the burial process this concept of things going into the unconscious and being then reborn as something new. So we're talking here about symbols, and we have really a lot of symbols for this rebirth process. One of the most famous one is, of course, of the phoenix, so of the bird that burns, but burns out, goes into ashes, and just as it turns into ashes, it's reborn again and is full of energy, is full of life. And in alchemy, you have a similar symbol with the eagle, also with the peacock that loses its feathers in the winter, and in spring it gets these feathers again that are then very lively, very colorful. You have it also in Greek mythology with, it was Kore or Persephone, who goes for half a year into the underworld, and Demeter, her mother, cries and lets basically everything die on earth until she emerges again. And this is how the Greeks symbolically try to explain the seasons. And of course, when we're with Christianity and with Jesus, we are with the symbolic meaning of the fish, for which this quote is for. The fish in dreams occasionally signifies the unborn child, because the child before its birth lives in water like a fish. Similarly, when the sun sinks into the sea, it becomes a child and fish at once. The fish is therefore a symbol of renewal and rebirth. Again, for Jung, not a coincidence that these things are then lumped together. And you have it even in baptism in the church, that you kind of drown people to let them be reborn then as Christians. So the idea of water being for renewal, we have this also in symbolic terms in baths, and a lot of images that things disappear in water and then re-emerge again. And we have stories for this idea of rebirth. And this is very much associated with a dissolution, which Jung calls dissolution as a prerequisite for redemption, meaning a kind of falling apart, similar as, for example, the phoenix falls apart into ashes to be then reborn. We have that codified in very famous stories all over the world. Beginning here on the left with Osiris, who was tricked by his brother Set and murdered and basically dismembered, and his bodily remains spread over Egypt. With his wife searching for all the pieces, assembling back again, reviving it for a short moment to have intercourse and become pregnant by him to then create his son Horus, who's able to defeat Set. So again, you have this story of death, disassembly, and then rebirth through the mother, in this case, into something new, into a new body that is able to take on the tasks that the old self was not able to handle. Here in the middle, we have Dionysus, that even has in his name the meaning twice born. So Dionysus got torn apart by the Titans when he was an infant, and Zeus took his parts and sewn it into his thigh and let him then later be there born again. And Dionysus very much associated with festivities and with nature. Similar, he was also spread over nature, and nature became infused by him. And he later had these cults of women who ritually would tear apart men in like a crazed frenzy. And then we have the story on the right of Jesus Christ again, who also suffered and got tortured and got reborn. Now comes the interesting thing. What is happening in the Mass in the Catholic Church, the Eucharist, so the symbolic acting out of the suffering and rebirth of Jesus Christ. The bread is the flesh of Jesus Christ, and the wine is the blood of Jesus Christ that then gets consumed by the communion, so by the church, to be spread throughout the people, so that becomes one with them. And like being reborn there. And the interesting thing about all these three stories is that they're very closely linked. They're so linked that the Christian church even said, oh, actually the story of Osiris and Isis and the story of Dionysus, they are a kind of preparation for the real story of Jesus when he emerged. Jung would look at it very differently. He would say, oh, we have here a story that repeats itself again and again. We have different figures that act out different patterns that he would describe as archetypal. Again, showing their psychological transformation and psychological processes that happen within ourselves, but that we codify in these stories and celebrate through traditions. So there was an Osiris tradition, a Dionysian tradition, and also, of course, still it's Jesus Christ tradition, that people want to experience the story again and again. And we can go also so far that the stories that we have in movies and in books and all these different things, this is the story we're looking for the hero that dies and gets reborn again. So this dissolution aspect is very important. This falling apart, this disharmony, how Jung would also describe it in the psyche, what's happened psychologically to his patients when they have a neurosis, when they have a complex or a psychosis. Suddenly it's not one consciousness anymore, but rather it splinters off and it's not a unified whole anymore. And it kind of falls apart until the point where it doesn't. So I have here 2 quotes to deal with that. For the goal to be attained and the transformation to be completed, a sacrifice has to be made. To achieve the new, the old has at least partly to be abandoned. This is the old, die and become. And the second one, only through extreme pain do you experience yourself. You believe then that you are a unit. Before that, you can imagine that you are anybody, the Pope or Mussolini. You are not necessarily yourself. Afterwards, when you have undergone this extraordinary experience of the self, there are no illusions any longer. You know exactly who you are. So it is a psychologically falling apart, similar as in the stories and in the myths, that happens then within us psychologically. This is why the suffering and sacrifice aspect is so horrifying. You're suffering under your incompleteness and you still sacrifice a part of you to get to a different place. And I have to really talk about this in a very vague sense. And I guess the symbols do it and the mythology does it way better. There is something very interesting happening psychologically that feels really like a renewal. So this mirrors again the myths. But now comes the interesting part. And this is the assembling part. That just means when the things are gathered again, similar as the stories in Osiris or Dionysus, Jung says that the same thing happens for us in individuation, in becoming an individual, to becoming a whole, to become a unit, that we are collecting the things in our psyche that are not yet integrated, that are not yet part of us, but should be, that are destined to be our parts, but that need to be assembled and they need to be found. Similar how ISIS went all over Egypt to find, I think it was 42 parts of Osiris to bring him together to be then this god again. We need to do the same psychologically in us. And this is what this quote deals with. As a rule, one begins life thus scattered, and gradually through life one gathers their parts together. People come to me with the greatest illusions concerning themselves, and only slowly do they become aware of their many sides, which are just as important, but which are projected. It is as though these constituents of their personality have exploded and were only recognizable through projections. What they see in that person is part of themselves. It is quite intangible. But during the course of analysis, these different parts are reassembled, the object of analysis being them together into one functioning center. So Jung has this idea that we start out as a part of ourselves, similar like an acorn is kind of part of a tree, but it's not yet the full tree. So there are a lot of things that need to come to that to achieve a point of completion. And this is a very nice idea to think about, that how you are now is not how you will be. And at the same time, how you will be is already in your unconscious, and it kind of needs to reveal itself. And for Jung, there's different ways how this happens. One of, as in the quote, is projected. That means the things that we see outside are not actually so much outside, but rather they're reflections of our internal states. Our perception and experience is not objective. It is tainted by our subjective psyche and personality, which means if we are really intrigued by something, or if we really hate something, this is not a characteristic of the thing itself. Like when we hate a person, this is not that this person radiates hate, but rather this person creates hate within us, or love, or interest, or anything else. So this emotion is within us and is also caused by us. And this can then be explored to say, okay, why am I interested in persons, or why I'm really not interested in that person. And this tells us something about ourselves. This is then our individual journey to search for these things and collect them. And this is what Jung means in analysis. People come in a disorganized, disharmonious state. There are, to talk in like archaic language, parts of their soul out there in the world, and they're not where they are. They're not inside the person. So it is an investigation to find out where are the parts that you're missing and what are the parts that are not really belonging to you. It's really a selecting to gather something that creates something bigger. And for Jung, this psychological development is towards the self, the future you, the complete you, everything together as it should be and could be. The conscious and unconscious together, the unification of everything there is within oneself, which Jung says is kind of impossible to ever reach, but this is where one's life journey is towards, for this gathering process, to this resurrection and rebirth, to bring the things from the unconscious that got there by accident or just by circumstance, and bring them into the light and integrating them into a more complete human being. But now comes the tough part. Let's say we are assembled, we are resurrected, we are reborn, we went through the suffering, we went through the sacrifice. Does it end? And Jung would say no. Jung would not say that just because we went through suffering and we went through sacrifice, that this means we have transcended this condition of life. He does not say that our life will be free of conflict. And this is what this quote is about. Individuation, on the contrary, means intense consciousness of conflict. You never will be safe from conflict as long as you live. Otherwise, you'll be dead before you die. Conflict cannot be removed. If it seems to be removed, that is imaginary. Conflict must be if one lives at all. It is absolutely indispensable. But the way you deal with it, that is a question. Whether you are overcome by the conflict, whether you get drowned in it, whether you get identified with one or the other side of the conflict. Individuation simply means you find your place amidst the turmoil. You keep yourself in the midst of the conflict. You are in the conflict, yet above it. And this is something very hard to get, that the end of individuation, or not the end of individuation, but like the reaching of the self, the rebirth, the resurrection, your new you, your more complete you still will be limited. And there's still things to do. And it does not mean that the world is free of conflict and free of pain and all these different things. But the experience of that is very, very much different. This is what he's talking about. You're aware of the conflict. You're also in the conflict, but you're not identified with it. This is similar what also happens in a lot of therapy, to be aware of thoughts and feelings and being able to objectify this by saying, just because I have this feeling does not mean I need to act immediately on it. Just because I'm angry does not mean I need to yell immediately. Just because I have an idea to buy a boat does not mean I need to buy a boat now. So it is an awareness of the internal state, but choosing what to do and not being hitchhiked by that. This is what Jung calls an unconscious state, an possessed state or identified state, that you have all these different things running in the background of your psyche that kind of pull and tear you into certain directions and try to give you certain thoughts and emotions. It does not mean that these things are necessarily you and you need to act on those. That means like conflict is still there, pain is still there, suffering is still there, but the experience of it is then completely different. You're aware of it, but you're not identical with that. You're not acting on that, right? But it does not mean you're an internally blissful state. Rather, Jung would even say you're more aware of even more conflict, because before you might only have seen one part. You can be blissfully blind to the conflict and the suffering and the pain that you have inside of you if you're just identified with a small part of you. But if you're aware of more and more things, you see these paradoxes, you see these conflicts of the opposites and the tensions that is between them. But you're able to bear it better because you can kind of remove from yourself it. Remove not in the sense of ignoring it, but acknowledging it, but not being caught in it like in a maelstrom and in a watertight, a riptide, but being then really a complete thing, a unit that can act on its own behalf and acting in a moral manner, choosing what to do, and not being a playball of impersonal psychological forces. And Jung would also say, one rebirth is not enough. We know this better, let's say, in Eastern philosophy, which he really saw as deep psychological truth, that the Buddha, for example, got resurrected and reincarnated over 570 times. And he was a grasshopper, he was a tree, he was, of course, a human being, he was an animal. All these different things, though, that there's a constant renewal taking place, that you as you are, ideally, are constantly changing. You're moving towards a more complete state, which, of course, is always associated with this suffering, with the sacrifice, with dissolution, with reassembling, and then, of course, resurrection and rebirth, to be then in the next stage. But he says, the problem for that is always good is the enemy of better, because the better stage that you reach after such a transformation, again, will be the limitation for the next reincarnation. This will be then your next struggle, even though that it might seem like a relief, similar as, for example, you have lobsters or crustaceans in general, that when they grow, they have this protective shell that helps them, but as they grow more, they have to strip it off and renew themselves. Oh, the snake also very typical symbol of renewal because it sheds its skin. And this is also what this quote deals about. Individuation, is a most painful procedure to tear off those veils. But each step forward in psychological development means just that, the tearing off of a new veil. We are like onions with many skins. and we have to peel ourselves again and again in order to get to the real core. So this process happens continuously and should happen continuously. So it's not a one-time thing, even though that it would be very nice. And Jung describes this journey. Psychologically, you develop in a spiral. You always come over the same point where you have been before. But it is never exactly the same. It is as either above or below. A patient will say, I am just at the place where I was 3 years ago. But I say, at least you have traveled 3 years. And this is how Jung sees the psyche develop, with the self, like this ultimate goal in the middle, and us kind of spiraling slowly towards it, seemingly caught in this circle and in this constant rebirth and reincarnation and death psychologically, but moving towards something. And this is, even though that we will never reach it, this is what life is about, and our individual meaningful life. And this is what I personally really like about Jung, and I said it last time already. He makes no secret about it that the world is a difficult place. Living as a human being is a very, very difficult task. And Nietzsche also talked about it like you try to find the heaviest burden and you found yourself. So it's easy to suffer under oneself, how one owns under limitations. But Jung would say this is all true and this cannot be denied, but there's something happening after that. So in the dark, there's always the light. There's always a way out. If one does the proper steps, does the proper sacrifices, focuses on the proper things, then miraculous, hard to describe things will happen. Stuff that we can only talk about in very abstract or like spiritual, religious ways that transforms a person into something else, into something more. And this is something incredibly hopeful. Otherwise, it sounds all very depressing to be a human being just living in the world and how everything is. So this is always what Jung says. This is part of the process. This is normal. Like he says, a neurosis, a depression is a healing mechanism, even though that it does not feel like this in the moment, but there is something happening in the unconscious. There's a rebirth taking place. You're just not yet aware of it. And you kind of have to go through it. But there's something better on the end. And this is how it's supposed to be. This is why he says culture and mythology and these stories are so important, because you kind of have to remember human beings again and again. Like, this is part of the process. This is normal. This feels like awful at this time, but this is how things should be. And one story that always stuck to me is, even though that like Jesus Christ is God and the Son of God and the Son of Man and all these different things, like even his suffering was so big on the cross that he asked God, why have you forsaken me? Like, even for him being a God and being a mortal in this situation, being a human being, he was doubting the grand scheme of things and stopped believing, like, even in himself at this point. And this is what human beings go through. And we can only wish for us and also our loved ones that this is something that they go through quickly and swiftly and often with a lot of support. But yeah, this is all something we all share and something that deeply interested Jung and is a big cornerstone of his concepts and ideas about what it means to be a human being and how to experience the world. And this would conclude the second part of suffering, sacrifice, and resurrection and rebirth. And I want to thank you for the attention. And yeah, I'm curious about how the discussions will go. And yeah, thank you for listening.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about Jung, please check out the description.